Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, where your tax dollars go. Stephen Elmore of the Maryland Budget and Tax Policy Institute looks at Governor Ehrlich's priorities. We visit Provisions Library and the Innocence Project. DNA freed these folks from prison. Adam Taylor of Sojourners drops by to chat about Christian commitment to the poor. And Lauren Wheeler offers pointers on gardening, native species style. Plus, Reuben Jackson reviews John Slaughter's new book, Brother in the Bush, From Baltimore to Kenya and Back. We've got poetry by Derrick Weston Brown and Sunil Freeman, and Zoe Mulford sings Our Lady of the Highway and...
There's one piece of wisdom that sticks in my head. I heard it someplace, or it's something I read about someone or other whose grandmother said, life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to fold underwear.
Welcome to the Forum at the Coffee House. In 2002, Republican candidate Bob Ehrlich railed against what he termed the scorched earth spending spree of Democratic Governor Paris Glendening. Now, Governor Ehrlich is proposing the fastest growth in Maryland's budget in more than 20 years. It's a good times budget. In 2005, the state had its first surplus since Ehrlich was elected. So after years of austerity, the governor comes bearing gifts for higher education and state workers, and he's offering tax cuts to homeowners and military veterans. It is an election year, and what politician wouldn't rather hand out money than tell needy constituents to tighten their belts another notch? So, who among us stands to benefit from Bob Ehrlich's budget, and who doesn't? With us to better understand the state budget and the governor's priorities is Stephen Elmore, the director of the Maryland Budget and Tax Policy Institute. Welcome, Stephen, to the Coffee House.
Thank you, Mark.
We're talking about an 11.4% increase overall in the budget. Is that right?
That's right. When you think about the state budget, you first of all want to think about all the funds that we have available, and that's approximately $26 billion this year. And under the governor's budget would be something on the order of $30 billion. But the part of the budget that gets the most attention is called the general fund budget. That's the part of the budget that's made up of income tax revenues as well as sales tax and the lottery proceeds. And they're funds that aren't dedicated to any specific purpose before the governor and the General Assembly decide how they're going to spend them. Those are separate, say, from federal funding that's a hefty part of the budget. But the general fund budget this year is approximately $12 billion, so you can see it's less than half of the total. And under the governor's proposal, the 11% increase that you proposed, it'd be on the order of $13.4 billion, depending on what you include.
Now, a big winner in this particular budget is higher education in the state, which is going to get a boost of over 14%. Is that right?
That's right. Higher education is approximately 10% of the budget, and somewhere on the order of $1.4 billion is what the governor's proposing. And you're right, it was a very noticeable thing to people after several years of decline in the higher ed budget. For instance, one of the governor's first steps was to try to deal with the cost of higher education, and there was a decrease of about $58 million, which was a significant decrease between 2003 and 2004.
We're talking about in the state budget for higher education,
That's
2003, right. 2004.
That's
so if we
right.
were to look in the aggregate from the beginning of the Ehrlich administration and through the 2007 budget that he's proposing, where does higher education stand now as compared to where it was at the beginning of his tenure?
It's very interesting because once you take that dip a few years ago and you look at sort of where we are now, only in 2006 did the level creep up above the 2003 level, and even then the ground hasn't completely been made up. It's about a 1% increase, and so when people take into account the inflationary cost, you can see that it's effectively a reduction. But more importantly to the average person, And students and families are very concerned about the tuition and fee increases at Maryland's public universities. There are about a dozen, as well as community colleges. But if you look at the public universities, for instance, you're looking at tuition and fee increases for an undergraduate student living within the state. That person has looked at more than 30% increase in tuition and fees, and at some of the universities it's much higher than that. I think there are only 2 out of about a dozen of the universities that didn't see increases greater than 30%. Another example, if you think about College Park, the
Maryland campus.
Exactly. If you look at College Park, the increase is 39 or 40%. If you compare a different 4-year period, it could be as high as 45%. And those are stark increases, and we've certainly heard a lot from students and their families about those increases.
So effectively, there's been a 35% increase in the cost to a student and a 1% rollback in the amount of state aid to higher education during the Ehrlich administration?
That's right. The governor is proposing this year, as you mentioned, significant increases and about a 20% increase in student financial aid. Some would argue that he's trying to make up for lost time. I also think it's important to note, in the interest of fairness, that when you look at, say, College Park's benchmark institutions, the institutions it wants to be like, institutions like Michigan, Illinois, you see that they too have had significant tuition and fee increases over the past 4 years. So it's not as though the state is completely out of line with tuition increases nationwide, but you sure wouldn't want to be in that position if you had a choice about it, and people do have a choice about it with our state budget.
You've compared it to Michigan and some other places, but if we were to look at the one school that Maryland really wants to catch up with, which is UVA, how does it compare?
I can't be certain. It's not right on the top of my mind, but I believe when I looked last week, I believe that it's slightly higher than UVA, but not out of the realm, it's not out of that realm. I can tell you, I also thought it was important to note that you're looking at about a $5,300 tuition and fee package for a Maryland student a few years ago, and now it's upwards of $7,800, I believe. So it's just a very significant increase.
Very significant increase. State workers got a bit of a cost of living increase in this budget?
That's right. Across the board, the governor has proposed a 2% cost of living increase for state employees. They're on the order of 50,000 state employees. The governor also proposed some targeted increases to try to increase the salaries for corrections workers, try to recruit additional corrections workers, and that would be a 6% increase. The General Assembly is not entirely inclined to go along with those. One interesting thing that he proposed, which is unprecedented according to the state's Department of Legislative Services, the governor proposed that this 6% increase be retroactive to the start of this year, and the fiscal or budget year doesn't actually start until July. That is one of the things on the list for the General Assembly to consider reducing out of the governor's budget. It would be about a $16 million reduction. Now keep in mind, we're not talking about reductions from the 2006 level, but rather reductions from his proposal, which is a significant increase.
While there is this slight increase for state workers generally, and corrections employees would do considerably better under the governor's budget, what's happening with pensions for state employees and teachers under the budget?
Pensions is an area, one of two, that make up long-term promises that the state has made to its employees and teachers. And we've all heard stories about large corporations, as they enter bankruptcy, trying to renegotiate pensions and turning to the federal government in some cases for a bailout. The state is not in dire straits, but it is true that when you look at the long-term promises that the state has made, they are cause for concern, and it would be nice if the budget addressed them a bit more directly and with more funding. It's not completely fair, though, I think, to blame that on the governor, because it's a challenge for the General Assembly, too. I can tell you a little bit more. When you look at the employee pensions, the state is funded at about 88% of what it should be to cover those. the standard for the industry of where you want to be is about 90%. The bigger problem is retiree health costs, which the liability there has been estimated by the General Assembly at $20 billion. And it is estimated that in order to cover that and to be fully funded, you would need to put in about $1.6 billion a year. Well, I told you earlier the general fund budget is $12 billion, so you can see that would be a hefty investment. The governor, for what it's worth, has put $100 million, not $1 billion, in his budget for that this year.
For years, the governor said that none of these sorts of things, any investment in higher education, in anything would be possible unless the state moved to slots. We're hearing a lot less about slots this year than we have in past years because the revenue picture has improved sans slots. But looking forward, what will the revenue picture look like past 2007?
The General Assembly has a Department of Legislative Services, and they work to look at the state's own revenue estimates that come from the Comptroller's office. And the picture looks not so good in about 2 years from now. I will say there's been a history of these revenue estimates coming in on the conservative side, and I think all of us would want that to happen. You wouldn't want to be in a scenario in which your revenue estimates were much rosier than they turned out to be. But according to those estimates, the governor is spending more in 2007 than the government is taking in 2007, or will be. And the reason he's able to do that is we have a surplus that's been well publicized and you referred to, and it will be more than $1 billion come July. But that's not sustainable. The costs, particularly of K through 12 education, also healthcare costs, including Medicaid, are continuing to increase. And so it looks like within 2 years, according to these estimates, we'd have this, what is called a structural deficit, in which the money that you bring in any given year, if you were to freeze that and compare it to the money that you spend in that given year, it would not be large enough to cover that. And so it is cause for concern. I think the governor, for his part, would probably say, look, I tightened things down earlier because we had a situation that didn't look good. Now we're benefiting from that. We have surpluses, and so he's going to spend those.
And it happens to be an election year.
Right.
What better time to spend
an election year?
It's an election year for Democrats as well. And what are they saying about the governor's budget?
Well, not very much is good. I think they had a hard time figuring out how to attack it. Do you say he's a big spender, which some tried that tack? Some tried a tax and spend charge against him. I don't know that. I'll leave it to the politicians. That might be playing right into his hands. But it is interesting to see what they're going to do. What a lot of people don't know, I think, is that Maryland's governor has quite a bit of authority when it comes to the budget. The governor presents the budget. The General Assembly cannot increase levels within that budget. They can either reduce them or they can propose additional revenues after the budget's been passed.
So the Democrats are going to be stuck cutting the budget and cutting services or whatever.
He's playing chicken, I guess you would say, with them. And what they've indicated is that there's a gap of about $100 million between what they think should be spent, and he's about $100 million above that. And so over the course of March, I think we'll look to see the areas in which he would be looking, or they rather would be looking to cut.
Well, many thanks to Stephen Elmore of the Maryland Budget and Tax Policy Institute for walking us through this budget thicket. Probably the only thing we can say for sure at the time of this taping, early March, is to remind that a budget is not a holy writ of economic truth. It's a political document, all the more so in an election year. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
We have our current exhibition up called The Innocents, a combination of 45 photographic portraits of convicts who were exonerated through DNA evidence, which is meant to be seen with the artist's 20-minute documentary film of the same subjects and interviews with these subjects that you see behind me. And the idea is to actually experience these multimedia together. all of them were exonerated with the help of DNA evidence. The crimes they were convicted of were mostly rape and homicide. About a fourth of them were death row convicts. The problem with biological evidence, as any forensic scientist will tell you, is that it is hard to preserve, find. So we're talking about 20% of, say, all felony cases that have access to biological evidence in the first place that can then be used to exonerate them. So these are the really, these are the lucky ones. Taryn Simon's point is really to explore the role of photography in the criminal justice system. And when she began interviewing the exonerated, what she found was that the majority of them had been convicted through mistaken identity. Really an exemplary case, Ronald Cotton is the ex-convict here. He and his rape victim have become firm friends, and she has come forward, which I think is an act of great bravery, to try and really analyze the process by which visual memory can change. Jennifer Thompson says, I was asked to come down and look at the photo array of different men. I picked Ron's photo because in my mind it most closely resembled the man who attacked me. I picked out Ronald because subconsciously in my mind he resembled the photo, which resembled the composite, which resembled the attacker. All the images became enmeshed to one image that became Ron, and Ron became my attacker. Taryn Simon meant for, these are her interviews, the text that you see below the photographs, and the film that she made are meant to actually be the humanizing elements behind these very still photographs. So reading it, the narrative idea of reading these stories as a story, as a collective story, is I think what an exhibition like this, and I think what Provisions does best, what biography and memoir can do, or what the personal can do for the political.
After looking at mine, they say angels are supposed to be pretty, should have gossamer wings and all, with light shining out all about their lovely heads like slices of good morning sun. Type of light that makes your eyes tear up and run over like if you left the tub running. Church folks say blessings come like that. My angel come from the cornerstone of a long gone bank. Its wings are a limestone slab from a Masonic temple. Its body, thick like the skin on my hands, was cleaved from a homegoing marker I carved out years ago. My angel is pretty, sitting all hushed and cool so you can hear the air sing around its smooth head. Ask me where I found it, and I'll tell you, seek and ye shall find, 'cause God give it to me like he give me the mind and the hand, I suppose. And pretty angels is everywhere, some just waiting on a hammer and chisel to free 'em.
Welcome to the Willing Spirit at the Coffee House. Ever since the 2004 presidential election, the conversation about the role of religion in politics has moved to the center stage. That stage has largely been occupied by the Christian right, but other voices have emerged with a different vision. Like Sojourners, a 34-year-old Christian group based in Washington, D.C. For years, Sojourners has been calling Christians on the right and the left to refocus their political work on the people it believes Jesus most cared about, the poor and the disenfranchised. Over the past year, it's been organizing churches and individual Christians like never before in its history, and that's in no small part due to my guest, Adam Taylor, who serves as the Director of Campaigns and Organizing at Sojourners. Adam's a graduate of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and he's also an associate minister at Shiloh Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. Adam makes these connections between faith and politics in his own life, and he's passionate about helping others do the same. Adam, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
Well, let's just begin at the beginning. And, we live in a country where there's a separation of church and state in our Constitution. Why organize churches to work in the political sphere? Isn't that part of the problem? How can that be part of the solution?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of Americans, and progressives included, forget the rich history of religion in social movements. When you think of most of the social movements that have changed the face and the contours of our country, they have been motivated by a faith element. And oftentimes the church has been extremely active. So you look at the role of the church in the civil rights movement, which was really the primary institution that drove the movement and gave people the courage and much of the motivation to take on Jim Crow segregation. Or you look at efforts to reform child labor laws or the anti-apartheid movement. So many different examples where people of faith drew from their religion in order to speak for justice and to build a much more just America.
Well, these days when you hear about, values voters, people who are motivated in the political sphere by their religious beliefs, almost always that word values voters is used to connote folks who are active in the Republican Party or active on the religious right. And I know in the 2004 election there was an enormous amount of discussion after that about the influence of the right in electing George W. Bush. I wonder if Sojourners is trying to change that in some way. Are you looking to diversify what it is that a value voter is in the United States?
Well, it's been amazing to me how much the right has been able to take over the whole territory of religion. And I think in some ways it's almost been ceded to them by the left, particularly those on the left that are very nervous about the relationship between church and state and are really nervous when people bring their faith into the public arena. But I think what is needed is for us to speak very boldly, very prophetically about the kind of faith that we believe in, the kind, and in my case as a Christian, the kind of Jesus I believe in. How is it that for many Christians, and almost in the media, Jesus has become pro-rich, pro-war, and only pro-American? That is a false Jesus that many on the right have lifted up, very much making Jesus in their own image. And I think our responsibility as Christians is to lovingly but very prophetically speak out against that kind of abuse of the gospel and try to restore the integrity of a gospel that stands for truth, that stands for justice, that stands for caring and healing and for love. And that's the kind of work that we're trying to do at Sojourners.
So you guys are organizing a Christian left then?
Well, it's interesting because it doesn't always break into the neat categories of left and right. I think as Christians, we are meant to challenge both left and right and hopefully challenge all of us to reach a higher ground. So for example, there are some issues that we may be a little more moderate to conservative on, whether that's in emphasizing the importance of families and family values, maybe not in the same way that the right does, but really emphasizing the importance of reducing out-of-wedlock marriages and reducing teenage pregnancies. Yeah. On the other hand, we can't abandon the poor to their own condition and their own situation, particularly when we have a country that is characterized by so much injustice and so much structural racism. Mm-hmm. And so we've been fighting hard to beat back this budget that recently passed and a new budget that's been proposed this year, which is essentially rewarding the rich. It's giving more tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans and taking money out of our budget for the poorest Americans through Medicaid programs, food stamps, child care, student loans, all critical programs that help empower the poor and help provide very basic social services.
But you guys aren't just, sort of preaching about this to churches. You're not just trying to sort of agitate churches and try to get them to talk about it more. You guys are, you're actually a director of organizing, right?
Right.
I mean, you're organizing churches. How do you do that? How do you get churches to become active and not just, talking about it, but actually become politically influential?
Right. Well, a lot of it is being able to ground so much of what we believe in our faith. And I think there's a rich legacy of organizing within the church. I mean, if you think about a church, it's one of the only spaces we have left where people come together in community. They come together and they hear a word from the pulpit. Oftentimes that word is about contemporary issues. Now, sometimes that word is political, sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
But it creates a real venue for people to gather together based on some of their shared values and be able to act together to create change. I think one of the real dangers within the progressive religious community is we've been too timid. We've been too afraid of power. And power can have these negative connotations, but power can be used for constructive and for liberation, or it can be used for destructive purposes and for oppression. And so we need to build more power as a church, which means we need to learn how to do effective community-based organizing. We need to learn how to do effective advocacy, to use our voices, to be a voice for the voiceless.
Give me an example.
Okay. Well, I mentioned the whole issue of the budget.
Yeah.
Last year, we looked at the budget that was being proposed by the Bush administration, and we felt very strongly that this was reversing biblical values. Christ tells us to have a particular concern for the least of these, and this budget was attacking the least of these instead of supporting them and empowering them. And so we created a whole campaign called A Budget is a Moral Document, which is a very, very basic concept that budgets show our national priorities. They show who we value, who we don't value. And this budget was clearly not valuing those who are in the bottom or the least.
So did you give materials for churches to sit down and talk about budget
We
stuff
did.
in their...
We did. We created all kinds of resources for churches. We created a toolkit so that they could get engaged in the issue. We created sermon tips so that pastors can integrate the whole idea of a budget as a moral document into their sermons. And we organized a whole campaign to try to activate people in churches around the country to lobby their members of Congress to say this budget is fundamentally immoral.
Did you find that churches that in the past have been more reticent to be involved politically, churches maybe who, that would be new territory for them, did you find that there were people who stepped out in response to the Sojourners campaign?
We really did. One of the most amazing things that happened in this campaign is there's a national organization called the Christian Community Development Association.
Yeah.
These are Christian organizations that are on the front lines of service delivery. They're the ones serving soup to the homeless. They are providing housing. They are doing all the work that we think is so critical.
Yeah.
Yet many of these people got fed up by, on the one hand, the Bush administration patting them on the back saying, you're doing great work, we love your holistic ministry, and then taking away the very money for programs that are there to support the very people that they serve. And so we had tons of these leaders at the community level come to Washington, D.C. and join in an act of civil disobedience in front of Congress, where we said a very strong moral message to Congress that what they're doing was wrong, it was immoral, these budget cuts needed to be stopped. And we really juxtaposed what the right was focusing on that time, which was around all the controversy with Merry Christmas versus Happy Holidays.
Yeah.
And we were saying the real Christmas scandal is not that, it's actually a Congress that is balancing the budget on the backs of the poor.
Okay, so you got people out there not just talking about it in their church, but actually coming to Washington, and even for some of them being arrested in an act of civil disobedience. What's next? With some momentum coming out of that budget campaign, what's next for Sojourners?
Well, there's a lot of great momentum. I think we've really struck a chord across the moderate to progressive religious community. And now they're really asking, what is the vision here? The budget campaign was very reactive, and actually we have to do more of that work this year. We've got even greater increases for military spending. There's more cuts to vital social programs, and so we're going to have to do another round of the Budget is a Moral Document campaign. But we want to offer a more proactive vision for our country. We don't want to just be against things, we want to be really for things. And so that vision that we're developing is called A Covenant for a New America. And it was developed very much in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I think the waters of Katrina washed away a lot of our nation's denial about how many Americans are living in poverty. There's 37 million Americans living in poverty. And about the link between racism and poverty in this nation. And it creates a real window to teach people about the realities of poverty and hopefully to mobilize them to make addressing poverty a real priority. And we're going to do this by combining some of what we think is really critical that both the left and the right are saying about poverty. We need massive and strategic investments in education and healthcare and housing programs. And we need to do things that are going to help reduce out-of-wedlock births, It can help strengthen the family, strengthen communities.
So you see your organizing as really something that would bring the Christian left and the Christian right together, potentially.
We believe so, and we already see it happening. There's a real convergence across the left and right around the issue of poverty, and it is a bridge issue that can help us work together and see beyond some of our ideological and partisan differences.
Mm-hmm. Well, we wish you the best of luck. I think there's a voice there that's really needed in our country.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot of challenges ahead for you, though.
There are. I mean, we're certainly growing our list. We encourage people to join Sojourners, which is our weekly e-newsletter. If you want to learn what's happening in Washington and get our kind of spiritual and theological take on political issues, sign up and you'll get action alerts, you'll get all kinds of information.
Well, thanks, Adam, for joining us. The issues that you raised will, I'm sure, continue to be at the center of the public debate in this country, and we really appreciate you sharing not only your perspective on the connection between faith and politics, but also your passion for bringing those two together. I'm Heather Kirk-Davidoff, and this has been The Willing Spirit.
Thank God for the radio and convenience store coffee. 3 hours you've been on the road and it should have been done. Northbound to Delaware, you'll pass the temple where Our Lady of the Highway stands looking on. Blessed be the children and the strangers. We are all together. We are all alone. All the sleepless dreamers, all the restless angels. Bless all the wanderers far away from home. Red lights in the passing lane, hundreds of pilgrims, all your fellow travelers, you don't know their names. Some come through here every day, some have come from a long, long way. Our Lady of the Highways loves them all the same. Blessed be the children and the strangers. We are all together. We are all alone. All the sleepless dreamers, all the restless angels. Bless all the wanderers far away from home. White rag on the driver's door, glass on the shoulder. The ditches and the medians blossom with shrines. Fake flowers and a wooden cross, and the names of the ones we've lost. Our Lady of the Highways knows they're yours and mine. And blessed be the children and the strangers. We are all together. We are all alone. All the sleepless dreamers, all the restless angels. Bless all the wanderers far away from home. Hear the swish of the wiper blades, rain on the windshield. Passing exit 100A to the town of rising sun. Black sky fading into blue. Clouds shift and the sun peeks through. Our Lady of the Highways welcomes every dawn. Blessed be the children and the strangers. We are all together. We are all alone. All the sleepless dreamers, all the restless
That was wonderful. Welcome, Zoe, to our coffee house. A pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me, David.
So did you write that tune when you were going down the road?
I did.
It just has that, the guitar part just kind of rolls right along with it, and just...
I grew up in Philadelphia, and when I moved to D.C., I started driving back and forth a good deal and passing the statue, Our Lady of the Highways. I think she may be around Salisbury, actually. I may have that wrong.
Our viewers out there will write in, I'm sure.
Anyway, she's on the right side of I-95 before you cross the border into Delaware. And
that's more like Elkton or something.
Yeah.
But we digress. Let's see. So that leads me to think about your current recording, which also sort of has a roadside name, doesn't it? It's called
Roadside Saints.
Yeah.
Partially because of that song, which is on it.
And again, we think of highways as they have certain markers on them, and I bet the songs are some of those markers.
There are a lot of road songs, and I was thinking about the people and things that watch over us when we travel.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me, okay, if you tell actors to break a leg, what's the right thing to say to musicians? And I had no idea. And that evening I was loading up.
Break a string?
Yeah, I was loading up to go to a gig, and my sweetie said, drive safely. And I thought, that's it.
Right.
That's what you tell musicians.
Right. There's a columnist in the Post, Tony Kornheiser, that closes his show with, if you're out on your bike tonight, do wear white, which he closes no matter when the show is, even if it's 11 in the morning. I know that album has been produced by John Jennings. That's very exciting.
It is, and it has been such a delight to work on.
Yeah.
I think one of his talents is getting artists out of their own way.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, and you trust his judgment, because anybody that co-produces with Mary Chapin Carpenter over the years, he knows. He knows, yeah. So that's very exciting. You're also going to play a banjo tune.
Yes, I am.
I know that because there's a banjo there. It's a sparse stage, so we didn't put it up as a prop. What are you going to take us out with?
This is from the previous album, which is called Traveling Moon.
Good, we segued that in, that's good.
Yeah, and title of the tune is Life is Too Short to Fold Underwear.
Okay, well, I'll go back and wrinkle some.
There's one piece of wisdom that sticks in my head. I heard it someplace, or it's something I read about someone or other whose grandmother said, life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to play solitaire. Get off your duff, it's time to begin. There's good deeds to do and there's sins to be sinned, and there's not enough time to fit it all in. Life is too short to fold underwear. I love to get people singing this in church. Life is too short to eat processed cheese or mealy tomatoes or third-rate Chinese, or to live someplace dismal without any trees. And life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to play solitaire. Get off your duff, it's time to begin. There's good deeds to do and there's sins to be sinned, and there's not enough time to fit it all in. Life is too short to fold underwear. Well, life is too short to spend it alone, or with folks that are mean, or a long way from home, or to serve an obsession that isn't your own. And life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to play solitaire.
what happens when a tragic series of events leads a successful African-American stockbroker from his home in Baltimore, Maryland, to what turns out to be a life-changing sojourn to the bush in East Africa? That question and much, much more can be found in John Slaughter's Brother in the Bush, an African-American search for self in East Africa. I don't know how familiar Slaughter is with the poetry of Rilke, but one of Brother's greatest strengths is the way in which the author, to quote Rilke, loves the questions which surround his life after he confronts, shoots, and kills an intruder in his Baltimore row house. The pages which follow are filled with contradiction, pain, and an inner restlessness which eventually leads Slaughter to the first of several encounters with the Maasai tribe and himself. The author's description of the East African landscape and the individuals he encounters are probably reason enough to give the book a spin around the block. But they aren't the only jewel found within the tome's 135 pages. Some of the book's most compelling and bittersweet moments occur when, like all African Americans who've had the experience of visiting the motherland, he realizes how American he truly is. Fortunately for us and Brother's rich text, Slaughter explores the roses and thorns of that revelation and turns its potential poison into medicine. I can't recommend this rich, nuanced elixir of a book enough. I'm Reuben Jackson, and this has been Writer's Block.
Welcome to 21st Century Life here at the Coffee House. Spring is on its way, a time when all good gardeners think of how to boost the color and grandeur of home landscapes with, say, new plantings of Japanese barberry or English ivy, or maybe a few Norway maples later in the season. But wait, just think about those names. Those plants are all from foreign countries, and in recent decades, they and a large host of other quote-unquote exotic invasive plant species have jumped from our gardens and lawns into our forests and meadows, and they're wreaking ecological havoc everywhere. Scientists now say the three leading causes of life form extinction worldwide are habitat loss, global warming, and third, invasive species. In our region, you need look no further than our own beloved Rock Creek Park to see Asian bittersweet vines and English ivy escape from well-intentioned gardeners long ago, now strangling native trees and other plants. The good news is that change is afoot among local gardeners in our area. Go to any commercial nursery today and you'll see native decorative plants for sale to enhance your landscape. Here today to discuss this new trend is Lauren Wheeler, co-owner of Natural Resources Design, an ecologically focused landscape design firm here in the DC area. Lauren, welcome to 21st Century Life here at the Coffee House.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Lauren, how did we get into this mess? I mean, we've got all these plants from all these other countries that don't belong here, and now we're experiencing this problem of them wandering beyond our gardens and causing all these problems. How did we get into this place to begin with?
Well, I think the answer is quite simple. This is a nation of immigrants, with the exception of the Native American peoples, and as a nation of immigrants, particularly those of us that are of European descent, have brought over the gardens that we were familiar with. So in our case, we bring over English gardens, European gardens. So we're bringing over these concepts of garden from England or France or other places and trying to put them into each one of our own little suburban lots or urban settings. And as that result, we've brought over plants that are from those places that we or our ancestors were familiar with.
Well, I mean, these plants certainly are beautiful and have at least served a purpose in being decorative in our gardens. But I know that you like to emphasize that these plants are not that easy to grow compared to local species.
It should be said that of the exotic plants that we use in our gardens, only 10% escape and become invasive problems within our native and natural habitats and woodlands. So that's the first thing to be said. The second thing is to be said, given outside those 10%, a lot of the plants that we use have to be pampered. They almost have to be, coddled along to be brought and to be made beautiful into our gardens.
Because genetically they haven't evolved here, and so they take a lot of effort, extra effort, some species, to get them to grow.
They take extra water, they take extra fertilizer, and they take extra maintenance, including turf grass. Turf grass is exotic.
So they're harder to grow, many of them. Now, the 10% that are quote-unquote invasive, now those tend to wander elsewhere. What are some of the problems that we see with those exotic invasive species?
Well, you have to remember that oftentimes when we use the word habitat, we think of wildlife, but it's not just habitat for wildlife. We're also talking about habitat for native plants. And so that means that what are the woodland flowers in our eastern deciduous forest, which is what most of the mid-Atlantic region was comprised of, those get like Japanese barberry. You find that everywhere in our woodlands now. And it's over-competing with the same space that our native plants would be. Or English ivy is a great example. You can hardly find any spring flowers that are coming up in Rock Creek Park because English ivy has taken over that entire space. They compete better than our native plants.
Now, those that you just mentioned, they began in home gardens. They began in people's yards, and they look nice, and no one intended for them to destroy many of the native species in Rock Creek, but that's in fact what's happened.
Right, so Japanese barberry, burning bush, Norway maple, the English ivy, even the vinca now is spreading out from home gardens that we were planting in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And in the 90s, we began to get a hint that these plants were really going to start taking over some of our woodland forests, like Norway maple has taken over large areas of the New England sugar maple habitat. But so those weren't intended, but they were beautiful plants. So people put them in the garden, and you can still buy a lot of those plants in your local nursery.
Now, the good news is that there's change happening. Tell us what's going on. Your company emphasizes using native plants to landscape your yard, your garden, and is that becoming a recognizable trend in the region?
I think it's exciting. I've been in the landscaping business for over 20 years in this region. I was one of the people that was planting burning bush in the 70s and 80s, and I figured these are really aesthetically beautiful gardens, but they're not ecologically sound gardens. So I went back to school and I learned how, back to graduate school, and I looked at how I was doing plantings before, and I did a new emphasis on how to do gardening that is ecologically sound. And I see it, as you say, afoot all throughout. Now you can go to some of the popular nursery centers in this region and find native plants that are well grown, you're capable of putting into gardens. And yes, in our company we try and use between 80 and 100% of native plants in all the gardens that we design and install, while using the same aesthetics that people have grown accustomed to.
So you can make a exclusively native plant garden look beautiful.
Absolutely.
I mean, colors, flowers, something blooming all summer long,
absolutely.
Greenery, screens, the whole deal. Same thing you could get with traditional European plants or plants from other countries. That's possible.
That's very possible. And it's important to recognize that, again, those gardens are going to take less care. They'll still take watering when you first install them to get established, but they're still going to take weeding, but other than that, we're really talking about a less maintenance on those gardens.
Well, let's look at some of the more popular species that you promote in your native landscape. Here, what do we have here?
This is American beech, and this is a planted swale of all native species in the Potomac floodplain. This is a butterfly weed, which is an attractant to monarch butterfly and is also used in this planted swale. A wonderful native azalea, pinkster bloom, such a lovely breath of spring in our eastern woodlands. And the tall, dead tree in the middle is intentional. That is a wildlife snag set amongst red maples. In my opinion, there's nothing more gracious than a sycamore tree or inspirational and looking up into the heavens that is just a sycamore tree.
Now, everything we saw there, and there were some really nice flowers and plants, those are all from Maryland, Virginia, D.C. area.
They're from this region. And in fact, we have a couple growers in this region, native nurseries, that grow genotypes that are specifically collected. The seeds are collected from specifically this
So
region.
there are now farms that are growing these plants for people in suburbia to purchase and to plant.
Exactly, yeah.
And what are some of the downsides of using native plants? I mean, if this is such a good idea, why does it seem to have taken a while to catch on? Is there any downside to this?
Well, I can't really think of anything, but I will say one thing. even some of our native plants, which we kind of poo-pooed because we were so familiar with them, they actually were found in Germany as being wonderful ornamental plants, and now the German designers have come over and brought them back for us to appreciate. So part of it is understanding what it takes to restore our sense of place here, restore our local character and our local regional botanical historic character of this place. You know, we're losing woodlands and meadows all the time.
And I will confess that my entire front yard is native landscaped and has been for a number of years, and your company helped consult on that. And it's gorgeous. I mean, all summer long we have flowers blooming in succession. It's a stunning garden, and people who are interested, we give tours of this garden every 2 months, and you can learn more by going to ChesapeakeClimate.org, and you'll know when the next tour is. It'll be sometime in April.
I do want to mention one thing about your garden. Your garden was installed two and a half years ago.
2.5 years ago.
Last year, we saw monarch butterflies on some of the milkweed, the swamp milkweed that were put in there. So that's great, because now you're seeing that you're starting to get the monarch butterfly in there. So we're talking about native plants providing habitat.
Now let's talk about that for a second, because it's not just feeling good by having a native plant and knowing that it's still pretty, still decorative, and you're not contributing to some of the ecological problems outside your yard, but also these native plants tend to attract other bountiful creatures.
You're creating your own wildlife habitat, and that is a magnificent component, because we need to recreate them. We need to reestablish them, and the places that they have to be reestablished is in your and my backyard.
So these yards, you know, if you multiply, you know, you have successive yards, you're actually creating an extensive, although decorative, an extensive man-made habitat that's good for birds, and I know you've mentioned hummingbirds.
Right, hummingbirds, cardinal flower, I mean, both crossvine and the native honeysuckle vine, hummingbirds are really attracted to that. So you can bring in butterflies, you can bring in birds, you can set up your gardens to have wildlife habitat settings within them, and it can be a place for your children to explore, to understand how nature works.
Now I know there are a lot of people, it's springtime now, and people are thinking about gardening. They can go to local nurseries and ask for native plants, and they'll be guided to certain native plants. And also, how do people learn more? Where can they go?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that there are a lot of great local organizations. There's the Maryland Native Plant Society, which has a fabulous website, and also the Virginia Native Plant Society. And they list on their nurseries, native nurseries that you can go, or you can visit your local public gardens in the springtime, and they have native plant sales.
And Maryland Native Plants, do you know their website?
I don't know the website.
Just Google Maryland Native Plants.
Just look up Maryland Native Plant Society, and it immediately comes to that organization.
Well, a big thanks to Lauren Wheeler of Natural Resources Design for explaining how we can have a beautiful home landscape while simultaneously enhancing and protecting the natural world around us. Who needs English ivy and Norway maples when going native is so darn cool?
Silver birch shimmered so crisp in that Ontario light, sight couldn't hold it all. So something like hands on the temples, a murmur as all that overflow shine eased almost into sound, like chimes, but soft. Air tuned so high it hinted at maple syrup. The first blackberry was a surprise, its globe facets gem-like. Then we found a new universe in our mouths. We ate like gods by the dirt road. I grew fluid in the lakes and rowboats slow lapping. Not enough air pressure to speak of a wind. It reached me halfway. I could just feel my skin. My father said, "Loon," after the bird's cry. His voice pulled me to attention, and I heard his word hook to the call. I gave in to that weaving. Words, sounds that cover the sounds of the world. We packed the gray Fairlane when the time came. I held 3 syllables, the box my parents never knew they gave me to hold it all, and replayed the sound in my head as we drove home. Sometimes it was dark wood or a jeweled case in the sun. Algonquin, Algonquin, Algonquin.